I stood at my kitchen window one Saturday morning, watching a concrete truck pour the foundation for what would eventually become the Brambleton Reserve Homeowners Association's new community pool, sitting almost entirely on a half-acre strip of my own recorded property. And I want to be honest that my first reaction wasn't outrage. It was the same steady, professional curiosity I'd built an entire career around. The particular calm that comes from already knowing exactly how this situation was eventually going to end. Long before anyone pouring that foundation had any idea they were building on land that wasn't theirs. My name is Thaddeus Cormorant. I'm 54 years old, and I've spent the last 26 years working as a land surveyor and title examiner. The kind of unglamorous but essential work that involves knowing, with considerably more precision than most homeowners ever bother to learn, exactly where one property ends and another begins. I bought a modest wooded parcel at the edge of Brambleton Reserve about 7 years ago, drawn to it specifically because the half-acre strip along its northern boundary, a gently sloped clearing surrounded by mature oaks, made for exactly the kind of quiet, private outdoor space I'd always wanted, even if I had no particular plans to develop it myself anytime soon. I want to explain something about how this situation began, because the timeline matters enormously to understanding why I made the choices I made over the following 2 years. About 8 months after I bought the property, Brambleton Reserve's developer, still finishing out the final phases of the subdivision at the time, approached me directly with an offer to purchase that same half-acre strip, intending to build a community pool and clubhouse addition on it. I declined the offer, explained plainly that I had my own plans for the land, and assumed, reasonably enough, that the matter was settled. It was not settled. The developer, I would later learn, had simply proceeded with planning the pool project on that exact parcel anyway, apparently operating under the assumption that a future sale or easement negotiation would eventually work itself out. An assumption nobody ever actually confirmed with me before construction began years later under an entirely different homeowners association board that had taken over community management once the developer's involvement wound down. I want to describe the moment I first understood the full scope of what was happening, because it happened gradually rather than all at once. The concrete truck I watched from my kitchen window that Saturday morning was just the beginning. Over the following 18 months, I watched a full pool structure take shape, along with a modest clubhouse addition, a paved parking area, and a decorative stone entrance sign reading Brambleton Reserve Community Pool and Wellness Pavilion. All of it sitting, according to my own professional survey work confirming what I already suspected from memory, entirely within the recorded boundaries of my own half-acre parcel. I called an attorney early on, a careful, methodical colleague named Perpetua Alderidge, who I'd worked alongside professionally for years handling exactly this kind of boundary dispute. I laid out the situation for her in full, the developer's earlier purchase offer, my clear refusal, and the pool project now actively under construction on land that remained, according to every recorded document I could find, indisputably mine. "You have an unusually strong position here," Perpetua told me, once she'd reviewed my own survey documentation alongside the county's recorded plat. "The question isn't whether you own the land. That's completely clear. The question is how you want to handle the situation strategically, given how much the association appears to be investing in a project built on property they never actually secured." I want to explain the reasoning behind the decision I made next, because it wasn't one I arrived at lightly, and it required a certain professional discipline to actually follow through on once construction began in earnest. Perpetua and I discussed the situation at length, and she made an observation that shaped everything that followed. "Right now," she said, "the association believes they're building on land they control, likely through some informal understanding left over from the developer's original plans that nobody ever properly documented or finalized. Every dollar they spend on that pool, every membership fee they collect for its eventual use, increases the eventual reckoning considerably more than confronting them today ever would." I want to be honest that watching an entire pool complex rise on my own land over the following 2 years tested my patience considerably more than I expected going into this arrangement. But I documented everything throughout that entire period. Photographs from my own property line, dated records of construction milestones, and eventually copies of the association's own newsletter announcements celebrating the pool's grand opening and subsequent membership drive. All of it building toward exactly the kind of overwhelming, undeniable record that would matter enormously once I finally decided to act. I want to explain what I discovered, working with Perpetua's formal records request to the association, regarding exactly how this situation had been allowed to proceed for so long without anyone properly verifying the underlying property rights. The current board, led by a woman named Cordelia Ashworth, who'd served as association president for just over 3 years, had inherited the pool project from the developer's original planning documents, which referenced the half-acre parcel as, in the original marketing materials, future community amenity space, without any accompanying deed, easement, or purchase agreement actually transferring or securing rights to that land. We understood this parcel had been secured as part of the original development agreement, Cordelia told me, during a call I made once the pool had been operating for nearly a year and a half. I wasn't personally involved when the project began, but I've always assumed the property matter had been settled before construction started. It was never settled, I said. The developer approached me directly about purchasing this exact parcel, and I declined. Nothing about that changed at any point since. I want to be fair and note that Cordelia's reaction, once she understood the actual history, reflected genuine surprise rather than any deliberate deception on her own part, considerably different from some of the more calculated situations I've heard described in similar disputes. She had, by her own account, simply inherited an assumption from previous board members and the original developer's planning documents, never once verifying it against the actual recorded property records. The same kind of institutional drift that lets exactly this sort of oversight persist far longer than it reasonably should. That didn't change the underlying legal reality, however. Perpetua's formal position, once we'd fully documented 2 years of construction and operation on my property, was straightforward. The association had built and operated a substantial commercial recreational facility on land they never owned, never leased, and never secured any legal right to use, for a period exceeding 2 years, collecting membership fees throughout that entire time for access to a facility sitting on private property that remained, in full legal terms, mine alone. I want to describe a conversation I had partway through that 2-year construction period with a neighbor of mine, a retired schoolteacher named Winifred Aldis, who had served briefly on the pool planning committee before stepping back once her own health made regular meetings difficult to manage. She stopped by my house one afternoon, curious, she said, why I'd never once objected publicly to construction happening so visibly along my own property line. I raised a question about the property boundary at one of the earliest planning meetings, Winifred told me, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea. Someone on the committee assured me it had all been worked out with the previous landowner, that the parcel had been part of the original development plan from the very beginning. I never had any reason to doubt that, and I imagine most residents felt the same way. I explained, as gently as I could manage, that I was in fact the landowner she'd been assured had already settled the matter, and that no such settlement had ever actually occurred. Winifred's reaction, a mixture of embarrassment on the committee's behalf and quiet relief at finally understanding what had actually happened, became one of several accounts I brought to Perpetua's attention, illustrating that residents had, in good faith, raised exactly the right question early on, only to be reassured incorrectly by a planning process that had never bothered to verify its own confident answer. I want to describe the formal demand Perpetua eventually prepared, because it reflected a decision I'd been considering carefully throughout those 2 years of watching construction proceed. Rather than simply demanding the association vacate the property and negotiate a proper lease or purchase agreement going forward, which would have been the more conventional resolution. I authorized Perpetua to include a formal demand for complete removal of all structures from my property within 90 days, along with compensation for 2 years of unauthorized use and the membership fees collected during that period. I want to explain why I chose that particular path rather than the more conventional negotiated settlement. 26 years of professional experience with exactly this kind of boundary dispute has taught me that associations which build first and negotiate later, rather than securing proper rights before construction begins, need to understand clearly that assumed permission is not the same as actual legal authorization, regardless of how much money or community goodwill has been invested in the interim. A negotiated settlement, arrived at too easily, risks teaching precisely the wrong lesson to an organization that had already demonstrated, over 2 full years, a troubling willingness to proceed on land they never bothered to properly verify they controlled. The demand letter, once delivered, produced exactly the kind of institutional panic I'd anticipated. Cordelia's board convened an emergency session within days, and I attended alongside Perpetua, along with roughly 60 residents who'd received notice, through the association's own newsletter, that the community's primary recreational amenity faced potential demolition over a property dispute nobody in the general membership had ever heard about previously. Cordelia opened the meeting by explaining, plainly and without much embellishment, the situation as she now understood it, the developer's original assumption, her own board's inherited belief that the matter had been settled, and my own formal demand for removal and compensation. A resident named Fenwick Osa, who'd served on the pool committee overseeing the facility's operation, asked the question that seemed to capture the room's collective disbelief. How does an entire community pool get built on land nobody actually secured the rights to? He asked. Didn't anyone check the deed before pouring concrete? Nobody in that room had a satisfying answer to that question, though Cordelia acknowledged plainly that the answer appeared to be that nobody ever had. I want to describe what happened over the following weeks, because the resolution, once negotiations actually began in earnest, moved considerably faster than the 2 years of construction that had preceded it. Facing the genuine prospect of losing a facility the community had invested heavily in and grown to rely on, the board authorized Cordelia and their own attorney to negotiate directly with Perpetua and me, rather than simply accepting the 90-day demolition demand at face value. I want to be honest that my own goal throughout these negotiations was never actually to see that pool torn down, despite having formally demanded exactly that as my opening position. 26 years in this profession teaches you that the strongest opening position and the actual desired outcome aren't always the same thing, and a demolished, functioning pool complex serves nobody's genuine interest, myself included, when a properly negotiated resolution can instead convert an unauthorized 2-year occupation into a legitimate, compensated arrangement going forward. The final settlement, once finalized, involved the association formally purchasing the half-acre parcel from me outright, at a price reflecting both current market value and the 2 years of unauthorized use and collected membership fees, along with a formal apology issued to the broader membership acknowledging the property had never been properly secured before construction began. Cordelia remained on the board following the settlement, having handled the situation, once confronted with it, about as constructively as anyone reasonably could have once the actual history became clear. The association implemented a formal policy requiring independent title verification before any future community amenity project could break ground. A safeguard that should have existed from the very beginning, but somehow never had, precisely the kind of gap I've encountered far too often over 26 years of examining exactly this sort of institutional oversight. I no longer own that half-acre strip of land, having sold it as part of the final settlement, but I'll admit there's a particular satisfaction in walking past that pool now, knowing every membership fee collected there today rests on a properly documented, fully compensated foundation, rather than an assumption nobody ever bothered to verify. My own remaining property still backs directly onto that same clearing, and I still enjoy the same quiet privacy I originally bought the parcel for, just with a rather more interesting story attached to it than I ever expected when I first watched that concrete truck arrive one ordinary Saturday morning. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever watched something get built on your own property that never should have started in the first place. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.